Daniel never thought the attic would hold anything more than dust, broken furniture, and boxes no one cared about anymore. Yet one rainy afternoon, with thunder rolling through the clouds and loneliness pressing heavy in his chest, he found himself drawn there. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was boredom, or maybe fate had been waiting for this moment all along. As he pushed open the creaking wooden door and climbed the narrow stairs, the smell of old wood and mothballs filled the air. Shafts of weak light pushed through the cracks in the roof, illuminating cobwebs that swayed with every draft. His eyes scanned the stacks of boxes, some marked with fading labels: Christmas decor, 1994, books, don't throw away, clothes for donation. But one box caught his attention immediately. It wasn't marked. Unlike the others, it was tucked far into the corner, hidden under a dusty tarp. Kneeling down, Daniel brushed off the grime, his fingers tracing over the fragile cardboard. The box looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. With a grunt, he dragged it into the center of the attic and lifted the lid. Inside were envelopes tied together with twine, the paper yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. His heart skipped a beat when he noticed the name signed at the bottom of the first letter, his grandfather, William Hayes. Daniel froze. His grandfather had died when he was only 6 years old, in what everyone had always called a tragic car accident. It was the kind of loss that cast a shadow over the family, never discussed at length but never forgotten either. Everyone insisted it was fate, bad weather, and poor timing. Yet here in Daniel's hands were words his grandfather had written, words that seemed to have been hidden intentionally. He untied the first bundle and carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant but urgent, as if written in haste. At first, the words seemed ordinary, filled with daily reflections and worries about family. But as he read further, a chill crept down his spine. There were lines about being followed, about suspicions of betrayal, about not trusting certain people in his inner circle. The words, "If something happens to me, no, it wasn't an accident," jumped off the page like a shout in the silence of the attic. Daniel's breath caught, his fingers tightening on the fragile paper. Memories of his grandfather flooded his mind. Though he had been so young, Daniel remembered William's warm laughter, the way he always carried peppermint candies in his pocket, the firm yet gentle hand that would ruffle his hair. He remembered the grief that had swallowed his grandmother after William's death, the bitterness that clung to family gatherings. At the time, Daniel hadn't questioned anything, he was a child, after all, but now, the words in the letter made everything feel different. His grandfather had known. He had felt danger closing in on him. Daniel flipped through more letters, his hands trembling. Each one hinted at the same fear: someone close to William wanted him gone. The words were careful, sometimes vague, but the undertone was unmistakable. He spoke of secrets tied to his business, of money missing, of meetings that ended in silence and stares too sharp to be ignored. Daniel's pulse quickened as he realized this wasn't a man rambling about paranoia. This was a man trying to leave a trail, a legacy of truth for someone to one day uncover. The storm outside rumbled louder, and Daniel felt his chest tighten with a mix of fear and determination. He sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, surrounded by piles of letters that suddenly seemed more valuable than gold. They weren't just family keepsakes, they were evidence. Evidence that his grandfather's death had been anything but an accident. His mind raced with questions. Who had wanted his grandfather silenced? Why had these letters been hidden so carefully? And more importantly, why had no one in the family ever spoken of them? His heart pounded as he realized the gravity of what he had stumbled upon. The letters had been waiting for him, perhaps for years, like a whisper from the past calling out for justice. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was now standing at the edge of something much bigger than himself, a dark truth buried deep within his family's history. And as the rain pattered harder against the roof above, he kept reading, each word pulling him deeper into the mystery his grandfather had left behind. Daniel barely slept that night. The words from his grandfather's letters clung to his mind like shadows that refused to fade. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that single chilling line, "If something happens to me, no, it wasn't an accident." His thoughts twisted into knots. For 23 years, he had lived with the belief that his grandfather's death was a tragic misfortune, the kind of cruel twist life sometimes delivered without reason. Now, those letters whispered that the truth was darker, more deliberate. And once an idea like that took root, it was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Daniel returned to the attic, driven by a hunger he couldn't explain. He needed to read more, to see if the letters could answer the questions that had clawed their way into his mind overnight. He tore through the bundles one by one, his eyes scanning every faded word. It wasn't long before a pattern began to emerge, details that didn't align with the official story of the car accident. William Hayes had written about specific threats, about strange encounters, about nights when he couldn't sleep because he felt eyes watching him through the dark. He described mechanical problems with his car that didn't make sense, parts failing too quickly, repairs that never seemed to hold. Daniel paused as he reached one letter dated just 3 weeks before the accident. In it, his grandfather described how his brakes had given out on a country road, but he had managed to steer the car into a ditch before any real harm was done. At the time, he wrote it off as bad luck. But in the next line, he admitted that his mechanic, someone he had trusted for years, had acted strangely defensive when asked about the repairs. Daniel's hands tightened around the fragile paper. His grandfather hadn't dismissed the incident entirely, he had worried that someone was tampering with his car. The words made Daniel's skin prickle. His grandfather had noticed the danger building, step by step, and still no one had listened. When the fatal crash finally happened, it had been brushed off as a rainy night, slick roads, and a life cut short. But the letters painted a different picture. The accident was no random tragedy. It had been prepared, staged, and executed by someone who had wanted William Hayes out of the way. Daniel's mind flicked back to the stories his grandmother used to tell. She always said William had been careful on the road, a cautious driver who never sped, never took unnecessary risks. Even on stormy nights, he had always insisted on waiting until the weather cleared. That made the accident even harder to believe. Why would such a man suddenly lose control of his car on a stretch of road he had driven hundreds of times before? The pieces didn't fit. And the more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized they never had. He sat back on the attic floor, staring at the open letters scattered around him. His chest tightened with a sickening thought. Had his own family known? Had they read these letters and chosen silence? Or had the truth been buried so deep that even they had lived in ignorance all these years? He imagined the coroner's report, the police investigation, the hushed conversations that had followed William's death. It all seemed so neat, so final. But the letters made it messy again, unfinished, a story with too many gaps. As the day wore on, Daniel found himself piecing together a timeline. His grandfather had grown increasingly suspicious in the months before his death. The letters became darker, filled with hints of betrayal, of secrets he couldn't trust anyone else with. There were references to meetings late at night, arguments about money, and cryptic remarks about people he thought were allies but might not be. It wasn't paranoia, it was foresight. His grandfather had sensed what was coming, even if he hadn't been able to stop it. Daniel leaned against a beam, exhaustion creeping into his body but fire burning in his mind. The letters weren't just old family relics, they were a warning, a plea for someone to see through the lies. And now, decades later, they had fallen into his hands. The official story of the accident crumbled more with every word he read, replaced by a haunting possibility. That his grandfather had been silenced not by fate, but by human hands. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping one of the letters tightly. The paper felt fragile, but the words etched onto it carried a strength that echoed across time. The truth was here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. And now that Daniel had seen it, there was no turning back. Daniel didn't want to believe it, but the more he read, the more restless he became. Keeping the discovery to himself felt unbearable, yet a part of him hesitated. What if no one believed him? What if the letters were dismissed as nothing more than the ramblings of an aging man? Still, the need to share gnawed at him, and eventually he decided he couldn't shoulder the weight of the truth alone. He began small, slipping fragments of his discovery into conversations with family, watching their faces carefully for any flicker of recognition or unease. The first person he approached was his mother, Claire. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched low on her nose as she leafed through old recipes. Daniel cleared his throat and mentioned casually that he had been going through the attic. When he added that he had found some of his grandfather's old letters, her hand froze mid-turn of a page. The recipe card slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. Daniel noticed the quick flush of color rise to her cheeks, though her voice tried to stay steady. "Old letters?" she asked. "What on earth would you want with those? They're probably just sentimental nonsense." But Daniel saw the way her eyes darted away, the way she fidgeted with the edge of her glasses. It wasn't indifference. It was discomfort, maybe even fear. He pressed further, hinting at the strange details in the letters, about how William had written of being followed, of not trusting certain people. Claire snapped her recipe book shut with a loud thud. "Daniel," she said sharply, "your grandfather was a complicated man. Sometimes he let his imagination get the better of him. You shouldn't read too much into those things." Her words were firm, but her voice betrayed a slight tremor. That reaction alone was enough to confirm what Daniel had started to suspect: his family knew more than they had ever admitted. The next day, he brought it up with his uncle Richard during a family lunch. Richard had always been loud and boisterous, the kind of man who loved to dominate a conversation. But when Daniel mentioned the letters, Richard's laugh came out hollow, too forced. "Old man Hayes," he chuckled, shaking his head, always writing down his worries like the world was out to get him. He was dramatic, that's all. Yet even as he spoke, Richard's hands fidgeted with his napkin, twisting it tighter and tighter until it tore in half. Daniel leaned in. "He wrote that if something happened to him, it wasn't an accident," he said softly, letting the words linger. Richard's smile faltered. His eyes flickered across the table, avoiding Daniel's. "Don't stir up ghosts that should stay buried," Richard muttered, almost under his breath, before excusing himself to take a phone call that Daniel doubted even existed. Everywhere Daniel turned, the reaction was the same: deflection, denial, nervousness. His grandmother, Eleanor, usually so open-hearted, stiffened the moment he brought up the subject. She refused to look at the letters at all, insisting they were too painful, too heavy with memories best left alone. But Daniel caught her wiping away tears when she thought no one was watching, her wrinkled hands clutching at her locket as though trying to hold on to a secret she had sworn to keep. The tension thickened around the family like fog. Conversations would suddenly halt when Daniel entered a room. Whispers followed him down hallways. It was as though the very mention of William's name, tied with the word accident, cracked open something the family had long tried to seal away. And with every defensive response, every nervous glance, Daniel's conviction grew stronger: his grandfather's death had not been as simple as they had claimed. One evening, Daniel sat alone in the living room, the letters spread out before him. His hands trembled with frustration and determination. Why were they hiding this? Why act as though the truth was something dangerous? If they truly believed it had only been an accident, why did the subject shake them so deeply? The defensive walls each of them had thrown up didn't silence Daniel, they only gave him more reason to keep digging. The family was protecting something. Whether it was a lie they had chosen to live with or a truth too ugly to face, Daniel knew one thing with certainty: he had just scratched the surface. And behind their nervous smiles and half-hearted denials, there was fear that he might uncover exactly what they had all worked so hard to bury. Daniel sat at his desk late into the night, the scattered letters lit only by the yellow glow of a desk lamp. His eyes burned from hours of reading, yet he couldn't stop. Each letter seemed to peel back another layer of his grandfather's life, and every line felt like a clue. He had been searching for something concrete, something more than vague suspicions and cryptic warnings. And then, almost by accident, he noticed it, the repetition of a single name. At first, it slipped past him. The letters were long, filled with reflections, complaints, and warnings that blurred together after a while. But as he organized them in chronological order, one detail stood out. The same name kept surfacing in William Hayes' words. Sometimes mentioned casually, other times with a sharp edge of suspicion. The name was Harlan. The first mention was innocent enough. Harlan insists I shouldn't worry, but I can't help feeling uneasy. Daniel almost skipped over it, but as he read further, the tone shifted. I don't know if I can trust Harlan anymore. His promises sound too rehearsed. Another letter, weeks later, was even darker. If anything happens, it will be because of him. I see it in his eyes. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his pulse quickening. Harlan. The name meant nothing to him at first, but the frequency of its appearance told him this wasn't a random acquaintance. Whoever Harlan was, he had been close enough to his grandfather to inspire trust, and later, suspicion. Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach as he realized his grandfather had been leaving behind not only warnings but breadcrumbs, clues pointing directly to this man. He grabbed a notepad and scribbled the name in big, bold letters, Harlan. Underneath, he jotted down every date and context where the name appeared. The pattern grew more unsettling with each entry. Harlan had been present at business meetings, had visited the Hayes home, had advised William on sensitive matters. And in the final letter that mentioned him, William wrote, Harlan says the accident was avoidable, but I no longer believe in coincidences. Daniel's mind raced. Was Harlan a business partner? A family friend? An employee? Or something more insidious? An enemy who had worn the mask of loyalty until it was no longer needed? He searched his memory for the name, trying to recall if it had ever been spoken at family gatherings, but he drew a blank. It was as though Harlan had been scrubbed from their collective memory, erased from family stories and photo albums alike. The next morning, Daniel tried probing his mother again, this time carefully. Over coffee, he asked, "Do you remember someone named Harlan? Did he ever spend time with Grandpa?" Claire's spoon clattered against the side of her mug. The sound was small but sharp, slicing through the room's silence. She forced a tight smile and shook her head. No one important. Just someone from the past. Don't concern yourself with it. Her tone was final, clipped in a way that told Daniel not to ask further. But her avoidance only fueled his suspicion. She had recognized the name. She had reacted too quickly, too strongly. It wasn't ignorance, it was avoidance. Later that day, he tested the waters with Richard. Did Grandpa ever talk about a man named Harlan? Richard's face hardened instantly. He drained his whiskey in one swallow and muttered, "Drop it, Daniel. That name doesn't belong in this house." And just like that, he walked away, leaving Daniel more certain than ever that the truth revolved around this mysterious figure. That night, Daniel returned to the letters. He read them slowly, carefully, savoring every word. The more he searched, the more Harlan felt like a ghost lurking in the margins of his grandfather's life, sometimes a confidant, sometimes a shadow, always present when things began to unravel. The name carried weight, a silent threat that stretched from the past into Daniel's present. For the first time, Daniel realized this wasn't just about uncovering whether the accident was staged. This was about identifying the man his grandfather had feared, the man whose name his family dared not speak. Harlan was more than a clue, he was a key. A key to unlocking the truth of what really happened on that rainy night so many years ago. And now that Daniel had found him in the letters, he couldn't stop. He had to know who Harlan was. Daniel couldn't shake the name. Harlan lingered in his mind like an echo, but the more he read, the more he realized it wasn't just about one man. As he pieced together the fragments of his grandfather's letters, the bigger picture began to sharpen. The words weren't only filled with suspicion toward Harlan, they revealed a darker truth. William Hayes hadn't just been fighting shadows. He had been surrounded by enemies, and many of them were people he thought he could trust. One particular letter stopped Daniel cold. Dated just a month before the so-called accident, it carried a tone that was heavier, almost resigned. His grandfather had written, "Even those closest to me are not what they seem. Smiles at the table, knives behind my back. I thought loyalty meant something, but now I see it as only a mask worn until the money runs dry." Daniel read that line over and over, the words burning into his thoughts. His grandfather hadn't been vague. He had been warning someone, maybe anyone who would find these letters, that betrayal was already inside the family's circle. Daniel sat back, rubbing his temples. His grandfather's world must have felt like a minefield. Business partners who were supposed to have his back, family members who should have protected him, even longtime friends, all of them suddenly seemed suspect. Every handshake might have carried hidden malice, every kind word might have been a calculated lie. It dawned on Daniel that Harlan might not have acted alone. He could have been part of something larger, a web of greed and rivalry where everyone had a role to play. As Daniel flipped through more letters, subtle references began to link together. His grandfather described private meetings that ended in heated arguments, whispered conversations cut short when he entered the room, and sudden financial discrepancies that were brushed off with excuses. What struck Daniel most was the shift in William's tone. He began his letters as a man trying to reason with those around him, but over time, the tone darkened into that of a man cornered, betrayed, and isolated. Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine as another possibility struck him. What if some of his own relatives had known about this all along? What if their defensiveness, their tight-lipped responses, weren't just about shielding him from painful memories, but about protecting themselves? He remembered Richard's sharp dismissal, his mother's trembling hands, his grandmother's refusal to even hear the letters read aloud. Could it be guilt? Fear? Or worse, knowledge? For the first time in his life, Daniel began to look at his family not as a source of comfort, but as suspects. The realization left him unsettled. He thought back to childhood holidays, to laughter echoing through the house, to the warmth of family dinners. Yet now, replaying those moments with the weight of his grandfather's words, he saw them differently. Smiles could have hidden secrets. Laughter could have been a distraction. Love, perhaps, could have been nothing more than a well-crafted disguise. The letters made it clear, William Hayes had been betrayed not by strangers lurking in the shadows, but by people who had been close enough to shake his hand, share his meals, and possibly even carry his bloodline. Daniel felt his chest tighten at the thought. Betrayal from outside was painful, but betrayal from within, it was poison. He sat alone in his room, the letters spread around him like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly together. But one truth was undeniable now. His grandfather's enemies had not been distant, faceless figures. They had been near. Too near. And if William's words were to be believed, they had been the reason for his death. Daniel clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath his skin. His grandfather hadn't been paranoid. He had been right. The so-called accident had been no twist of fate. It was the result of calculated betrayal, carried out by those William once trusted most. And Daniel knew, deep down, that the circle of enemies his grandfather described might still be alive, still living in the shadows of his family, still thinking the truth would remain buried forever. But they hadn't counted on him finding the letters. Daniel began to notice something new in the rhythm of the letters. Between the warnings, the paranoia, and the veiled mentions of betrayal, there were hints of something bigger, a thread running quietly beneath his grandfather's words. It wasn't only about trust lost within the family, it was about power, money, and competition. William Hayes had not only been a husband, father, and grandfather, he had also been a man of business, and the more Daniel read, the more it became clear that his grandfather's professional life had been far more dangerous than anyone in the family had ever let on. In one of the older letters, Daniel stumbled upon a passage that stood out. "The deal with the Millers is not what it seems. Promises made in daylight are broken in darkness. They've turned our success into a battlefield, and I fear they'll stop at nothing." Daniel frowned. The Millers? The name rang faintly, like a whisper he had heard once but never thought much of. He dug further, flipping through pages until another letter revealed more. "Harlan has tied himself too closely to the Millers. They speak of partnership, but I see only rivalry. They want what we've built, and they won't rest until it is theirs." A cold realization spread through him. This wasn't just about family betrayal, it was about business, about competition that had escalated beyond contracts and boardrooms. A rivalry that had started with deals and negotiations had evolved into something far darker, something deadly. Daniel's mind wandered back to the town where he grew up. There had always been whispers about the Millers, about their ruthless way of conducting business. His grandfather's company, Hayes Industries, had once been the pride of the community, employing hundreds, building a legacy of trust and respect. But Daniel remembered hearing that not long after William's death, the company faltered, slipping out of the family's hands and into the grasp of outsiders. Could the Millers have been the ones waiting to pounce? Could his grandfather's accident have cleared the way for them to take everything he had built? Daniel began to notice something new in the rhythm of the letters. Between the warnings, the paranoia, and the veiled mentions of betrayal, there were hints of something bigger, a thread running quietly beneath his grandfather's words. It wasn't only about trust lost within the family, it was about power, money, and competition. William Hayes had not only been a husband, father, and grandfather, he had also been a man of business, and the more Daniel read, the more it became clear that his grandfather's professional life had been far more dangerous than anyone in the family had ever let on. In one of the older letters, Daniel stumbled upon a passage that stood out. "The deal with the Millers is not what it seems. Promises made in daylight are broken in darkness. They've turned our success into a battlefield, and I fear they'll stop at nothing." Daniel frowned. The Millers? The name rang faintly, like a whisper he had heard once but never thought much of. He dug further, flipping through pages until another letter revealed more. "Harlan has tied himself too closely to the Millers. They speak of partnership, but I see only rivalry. They want what we've built, and they won't rest until it is theirs." A cold realization spread through him. This wasn't just about family betrayal, it was about business, about competition that had escalated beyond contracts and boardrooms. A rivalry that had started with deals and negotiations had evolved into something far darker, something deadly. Daniel's mind wandered back to the town where he grew up. There had always been whispers about the Millers, about their ruthless way of conducting business. His grandfather's company, Hayes Industries, had once been the pride of the community, employing hundreds, building a legacy of trust and respect. But Daniel remembered hearing that not long after William's death, the company faltered, slipping out of the family's hands and into the grasp of outsiders. Could the Millers have been the ones waiting to pounce? Could his grandfather's accident have cleared the way for them to take everything he had built? The letters suggested exactly that. William had written about contracts mysteriously collapsing, about projects stalling just as rivals began to thrive. He mentioned meetings that ended with veiled threats, men smiling too widely as they shook his hand, and offers that seemed generous on paper but carried traps hidden between the lines. In one chilling letter, he wrote, "They've warned me not to stand in their way. Harlan says it's just business, but I know better. Business ends at the table. Threats continue on the road." Daniel set the paper down slowly, his breath uneven. His grandfather hadn't been imagining things, he had been caught in the middle of a war disguised as business. And if the Millers had truly been involved, then Harlan had been more than a friend or confidant, he had been a bridge between betrayal and opportunity. The thought made Daniel's blood boil. All his life, he had been told that William's death was a tragic accident, something the family didn't like to revisit because of the grief it caused. But now he saw the truth. It hadn't been grief that silenced them. It had been fear. Fear of digging too deep into the rivalry that had destroyed his grandfather and reshaped their lives forever. Daniel pulled his laptop closer and began to search online for any trace of the Millers. His fingers trembled as he typed, his screen filling with news articles, business reports, and old company records. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. Within months of his grandfather's death, Miller Enterprises had acquired contracts that Hayes Industries had been competing for. Projects William had written about losing mysteriously had ended up in their hands. It wasn't coincidence. It was conquest. He leaned back in his chair, anger tightening his jaw. His grandfather had fought to protect what he built, but he had been cornered. Betrayed from within, pressured from without, and finally erased in a way that could be dismissed as fate. The rivalry hadn't just been business, it had been personal, a vendetta cloaked in profit margins and signed contracts. And Daniel now understood why the letters had been hidden for so long. They didn't just expose a family betrayal. They implicated powerful rivals, people who might still wield influence even decades later. Daniel stared at the word Miller scribbled beside Harlan on his notepad. Two names, two threads, both leading back to the same conclusion: William Hayes hadn't died by chance. He had been eliminated. And if the Millers had gotten away with it once, Daniel wondered what they might do if someone started asking questions now. Daniel sat in silence, the storm of discovery tightening around him with every letter he unfolded. Until now, the words had painted a picture of tension, betrayal, and rivalry, but it was one detail, repeated in different forms across several letters, that made his chest seize with dread. His grandfather hadn't merely feared betrayal. He had suspected the method of his end long before it happened. The accident, the one everyone in the family spoke of with hushed grief, had not been fate's cruel hand. It had been engineered. In one of the final letters, dated just days before his death, William Hayes wrote, "The car feels different again. The brakes are new, or so I was told, but the strain returns. Harlan says I imagine it, yet I hear the grind when I drive. I cannot dismiss this as age or wear. Someone has touched it. Someone means for it to fail." Daniel's heart pounded as he read the words over and over. His grandfather had known. He hadn't been caught off guard by a slick road or heavy rain, he had been living with the awareness that the machine carrying him could betray him at any moment. And when the crash came, it wasn't a random tragedy. It was the culmination of days, perhaps weeks, of sabotage. He pushed back from the desk, pacing the room, anger coursing through him. All his life, he had been told the story with the same rehearsed sympathy. It was raining hard, the road was slick, he must have lost control. But now Daniel could see the script for what it was, a carefully planted lie. William's letters told the truth. The brakes had been tampered with, the car deliberately pushed toward failure. The so-called accident had been nothing more than murder hidden beneath circumstance. The more Daniel thought, the more the puzzle pieces locked into place. His grandfather's suspicions of Harlan, the rivalry with the Millers, the defensive reactions of his own family. All of it pointed to a plot carefully laid out, carried through with precision. Whoever had staged the accident hadn't just wanted William silenced. They had wanted him erased in a way that could never be questioned. Daniel pictured it vividly in his mind, his grandfather driving that night, rain beating against the windshield, wipers struggling to keep up. He could almost hear the moment when William pressed his foot down, expecting the car to slow, only for the brakes to grind uselessly beneath him. Panic must have flooded his chest as he realized the trap had finally sprung. And then the crash, the flames, the silence that followed, written off as nothing but misfortune by those who knew better. Daniel gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. The letters weren't just warnings anymore, they were evidence. His grandfather had tried to leave behind a testimony, proof for someone willing to see past the lies. And that someone was him. But another thought struck Daniel with equal weight. If the accident had been staged, if William had been silenced so carefully, then surely others had been complicit. The mechanic who fixed the brakes, the business rival who stood to gain, the family members who had buried the truth, this wasn't the work of one man alone. It had been a conspiracy, orchestrated with ruthless efficiency. And every false smile he'd grown up around might have belonged to someone who knew. He sank into his chair again, staring at the letters spread before him like scattered shards of glass. The story of his family was no longer one of tragedy, it was one of blood, betrayal, and a murder dressed up as chance. The accident had never been an accident. It had been a message. A silencing. And the longer Daniel thought about it, the more he realized the message hadn't ended with his grandfather's death. It lingered still, echoing in the fearful glances of his relatives, in their desperate attempts to change the subject, in their trembling voices when the past was brought up. They had all lived under the shadow of that staged accident, but Daniel was the first to see it for what it was. And once he saw it, there was no going back. Daniel knew he couldn't rely on his family to give him answers. Every time he asked, walls went up, tight smiles, quick dismissals, or outright anger. The truth wasn't going to come from their lips. If he wanted answers, he would have to dig for them himself. And so began the part of his life he never could have imagined, secret investigation. He started small, retracing the steps his grandfather might have taken before his death. The letters became his map, each phrase and data clue leading him deeper into shadows that had been hidden for decades. William had mentioned financial discrepancies, so Daniel pulled old public records. Hours turned into days as he combed through business registries, dusty archives, and online databases. The picture grew clearer. Just before the accident, large sums of money had shifted hands. Shell companies had appeared suddenly, contracts had been transferred, and within months of William's death, Hayes Industries had been sold off in fragments. It hadn't been bad luck. It had been a takeover. But what chilled Daniel most was the connection between Harlan and the Millers. Harlan had been listed as a consultant in several of the Miller family's contracts during the same period when William had been writing his fearful letters. To the outside world, it looked legitimate. But to Daniel, it screamed betrayal. His grandfather had trusted Harlan as a confidant, perhaps even as a friend, only to be undermined from the inside. The deeper Daniel dug, the more dangerous it felt. One evening, while searching through old property records at the county office, he came across something he wasn't prepared for, a signature. It was his Uncle Richard's. Richard had co-signed a property transfer between Hayes Industries and a shell company connected to the Millers, just 2 weeks after William's funeral. Daniel's hands shook as he copied the document. The betrayal wasn't only from a business partner. It was from family. Everything clicked into place in his mind. His uncle, always quick to shut down conversations about William's death, hadn't been protecting grief, he had been protecting himself. Richard had benefited from the aftermath, perhaps even played a role in ensuring that the accident went exactly as planned. It was no wonder he became defensive every time Daniel pressed the issue. He wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of exposure. Daniel's investigation spiraled further. Old newspaper articles hinted at quiet settlements, agreements never made public. A retired employee of Hayes Industries, when tracked down, admitted in hushed tones that William had been too honest for the world he was in. The man refused to say more, but Daniel saw the fear in his eyes. It was the same fear that lingered in his grandmother's silence and his mother's trembling hands. They weren't just grieving, they were living under the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak. Late one night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, letters and documents spread across his table like a battlefield. His phone buzzed with messages from friends he had been ignoring, his work emails piling up unread. None of it mattered anymore. His life had narrowed to this singular mission, uncovering the truth of his grandfather's death. And in that silence, as rain tapped against the window, Daniel whispered the words aloud for the first time. It was Richard. It was family. The realization cut deeper than anything else. Betrayal from rivals was one thing, but betrayal from blood was something else entirely. His grandfather hadn't only been targeted by business enemies. He had been betrayed from within his own house. Daniel stared at his reflection in the dark window, his jaw set, his eyes burning with fury. His grandfather's letters had not only revealed the truth, they had passed on a burden. And now it rested on his shoulders. The staged accident had silenced William Hayes. But Daniel was alive, and he was no longer blind. The night Daniel decided to act, the weight of his grandfather's words pressed against his chest like an anchor. For weeks he had pieced together the puzzle, unraveling lies that had been carefully woven into the family's history. Now the picture was complete. His grandfather's accident had been a murder, engineered for profit, enabled by betrayal, and carried out under the guise of tragedy. At the center of it all stood Richard, his own uncle, smiling through the years as though nothing had ever happened. Daniel wasn't impulsive. He knew revenge required patience, precision, and above all, silence. He began by collecting every piece of evidence, letters, contracts, signatures, and testimonies. He copied them, digitized them, stored them in encrypted files. One set stayed with him, another he hid in a safety deposit box, and a third he prepared for release should anything happen to him. He knew the danger he was stepping into. If Richard had orchestrated his grandfather's death, then silencing one more family member wouldn't be beyond him. But Daniel wasn't just protecting himself. He was setting a trap. He tested Richard's movements, watching him from afar, noting where he went, who he met, how freely he carried himself. Richard was older now, complacent, too confident that the secret had been buried forever. He laughed at family dinners, talked about business with pride, and raised his glass to toasts of family legacy. Every time Daniel saw it, the bile rose in his throat. Then came the night of confrontation. It wasn't in public, nor at a family gathering. Daniel chose the place carefully, the old Hayes estate, now abandoned, the very home where his grandfather had penned those final letters. Dust covered the halls, shadows lingered in every corner, and the house itself seemed to whisper with the weight of its past. He asked Richard to meet him there under the pretense of discussing new information about Hayes Industries' past. Curiosity, or perhaps arrogance, brought him. When Richard stepped into the study, the sight that greeted him wasn't a business proposal, it was the truth. On the desk lay copies of the letters, the property transfers, the evidence of his betrayal. Daniel sat across from them, his grandfather's fountain pen in his hand, the same one William had used to sign countless contracts. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Richard's eyes scanned the papers, his face paling as he realized what Daniel knew. He tried to laugh it off at first, to wave it away as paranoia, old grievances distorted by grief. But when Daniel recited, word for word, the letter about the tampered brakes, Richard's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and in that flicker of rage, Daniel saw the guilt he had been waiting for. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. You staged his death. You stole everything he built. And you thought you buried the truth. But I've dug it up, and now, everyone will see it. Richard lunged for the papers, but Daniel was ready. The confrontation was short, violent, and messy, the years of hidden fury erupting in a single clash. By the end, Richard wasn't the untouchable figure he had once been. He was broken, physically, emotionally, and soon, publicly. Daniel didn't need to kill him. He had something far worse. He had exposure. The next morning, an email blast hit every major business outlet, local news station, and legal authority. Attached were scanned letters, financial records, and testimony pointing directly at Richard Hayes and the Miller family. Alongside it, Daniel included a message: the accident wasn't an accident. The truth belongs to the world now. The fallout was immediate. Headlines screamed of betrayal, corruption, and a family empire built on blood. Richard's name, once spoken with respect, became synonymous with treachery. Lawsuits followed, investigations reopened, and the Hayes legacy was rewritten, not as a story of success, but of greed and betrayal. Through it all, Daniel remained silent, watching from the shadows. He didn't celebrate, didn't boast, didn't smile. Revenge wasn't about joy, it was about balance. His grandfather had been silenced, but now his voice echoed louder than ever, carried through the very letters meant to be buried. And as Daniel stood once more in the old estate, letters in hand, he whispered into the empty air, "I did it, grandfather. They'll never erase you again." The storm outside rattled the windows, the house groaned with age, but in that moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't in months. Not peace, not closure, but something close to justice. The accident was no longer a lie. The truth had been revealed. And with it, the Hayes legacy was finally free from the shadow of betrayal.